Hello and welcome. If you haven't already, I invite you to please click subscribe. There's no obligation, and it allows you to be notified of all new chapters. Additional information about the story, including the author, chapter warnings, and rating, can be found in the description below. All credit goes to the original author. All That Remains by Orphan Account. Chapter 12. The Rage of the Elvenking. Third Age, 2941, 70 years ago. A few months after Bilbo's departure on his adventure, Legolas perched at the top of a shadowed tree, listening to their angry murmurs without the worry or fear many others would have been plagued with. Despite his best efforts, more and more trees were becoming shadowed. It happened often enough that the assassin could spot the signs when a tree was teetering on the edge of light. The first sign was easy to see, or hear to be more accurate. When a tree began to finally lose the light within itself, it started calling him Legolas. Then, its song would change, morphing into black speech. Not long after that, their own form of black speech would be the only tongue it could converse in and fully understand. Soon after, the tree would stop speaking of nature and start muttering angrily to itself, hissing if sunlight touched its blackening leaves. Finally, it would grow quiet for several days, emerging from its solitude with a fierce hatred of elves and cursing all things light. Watching these transformations from joyful to dark made Legolas weep at times. Sometimes he would be so distraught by the loss of light that he would walk away to cry in the tree above Siren's grave. Even though that tree had also fallen to shadow, it still kept its vow to protect Siren's resting place, the oath it had made so deeply ingrained within it that it would never betray Legolas's trust. Depending on how upset Legolas was feeling, he would stay at the oak tree for several hours before returning to the new shadowed trees and reintroducing himself. The tree's anger and wariness would last 5 to 9 days, but after that period of relentless rage, it would welcome him, recognizing Legolas. A hint of its old self would shine through. The trees would rarely remember Esgil, the elf they sang to when they were still light. They would only know Legolas, the strange elf that was not too bright and made them a little calmer and less angry at the world. The shadowed trees did not understand why Legolas wept sometimes when he stroked their dark bark. The forest had been doing so well. Orc and spider attacks were still down, but the shadow itself was reaching deeper into the forest. A new presence had revealed itself in Dol Guldur recently. A dark human calling himself the Necromancer. Though Legolas was not convinced the creature was human. No human would be allowed to run the Hill of Sorcery, not with the Witch King's lieutenant there. The elf had a feeling the Necromancer was much more than human. He just hoped that the White Council would take Radagast seriously when the Brown Wizard told them of the threat. The trees around Legolas continued to mutter, annoyance and anger focusing on something below. Legolas looked down absently and spoke a soft curse. Below him, tired and hungry-looking, were 13 dwarves and Bilbo Baggins. What were they doing here? Of course, Legolas thought, they must travel through Mirkwood to reach Erebor. It took them longer than necessary to reach here, though. I left at the same time, but have been here for almost a month. I wonder what delayed them. He watched 2 dwarves argue, another wander around with a dazed look on his face, and a 4th who looked ready to fall asleep. Why do I have the feeling that they have run into every pack of orcs, wargs, and goblins between here and Bree? Not knowing how close to being right he was, the elf considered revealing himself and offering to be their guide through the dark forest. The group was obviously lost and hungry. Also, They were looking at the surrounding trees with expressions ranging from unease to outright fear. It was obvious that even the dwarves could sense the forest's anger. The only one who did not look unsettled by the woods was Thorin. Legolas scrutinized the king under the mountain, taking in his hard look and the set of his jaw. He knew the proud dwarf would accept no help from an elf, even from him. "They're going to wander into a spider's nest at this rate, or run into a patrol of testy Mirkwood warriors," Legolas predicted with a silent groan. "I'm sure that a fish in the river can hear them stomping through the woods. Oh, orc spawn!" The elf saw the beginnings of spider webs in the trees around him. Sure enough, the dwarves were heading towards a spider's nest, as in spiders, plural. Of course they had to stumble upon the biggest spider colony in Mirkwood. Legolas cursed mentally, already spotting spiders creeping towards the dwarves and Bilbo in the treetops. It was too late to warn them to turn back. The spiders in Mirkwood were like any spider one could find in their home, except they were bigger than horses and a whole lot meaner and smarter. These spiders were large and furry, either brown or black in color, with sharp pincers and legs longer than a tall man's. Their bulbous bodies were fat, with a slight point at the end like a stinger. Their eyes were large and black, reflecting what they saw and glittering with both intelligence and malice. A screech ripped through the air, and the dwarves and Bilbo flinched, one of the dwarves screaming in terror as the spiders revealed themselves. Weapons were drawn, and the travelers stood in a defensive circle, shuffling bodies skittering around them. Bilbo's sword trembled as he held it, and Esgil could see the whites of his eyes, they were so wide. One of the spiders dropped to the ground, giant pincers snapping as it approached. "Hold your ground," Thorin said calmly, not revealing any fear he might have been feeling. The spider paused, lifting one foreleg and clacking its pincers. Its 8 eyes were focused on the travelers, their scared faces reflecting in the black orbs. The other spiders crept forward, all snapping and clacking, while their feet made no noise on the forest floor. One of the dwarves whimpered. "They don't stand a chance. They're too many. They're going to be killed," the hidden spectator thought grimly. "I cannot let that happen." Up in the trees, Legolas shifted, letting a small bit of shadow move over his frame. A spider spotted the movement and looked up as he intended it to. It spotted the glowing violet eyes that watched them from the trees and recognized them instinctively. Hashvuras! The spider gave a warning shriek, and the other spiders froze. As one, they bolted, fleeing the area and abandoning their prospective prey. The dwarves watched them go, with bewildered expressions on their faces. For a moment, none of them moved, so shocked were they. "Let's get out of here before they come back," the white-haired dwarf, Balin, urged suddenly. Thorin's stunned inaction ended. "Move!" The group ran, Legolas following them in the treetops. He would return and take care of a few of the spiders after he knew the dwarves and Bilbo were safe. The webs quickly disappeared, the forest brightening slightly, and the assassin recognized where the travelers had fled. More specifically, where they had fled into. You have got to be joking. No sooner had the dwarfs stopped to rest did 20 Mirkwood warriors appear out of the foliage, surrounding the dwarves with arrows on all sides. Wait, only the dwarves were there. Where had Bilbo gone? The assassin looked around for the hobbit, worried he had been left behind. He spotted his friend crouching in the shadows behind a tree, watching the elves with nervous eyes. One elf, the crowned Prince Aglar, if Legolas was not mistaken, approached Thorin. "Thorin Oakenshield, why have you come to Mirkwood?" the elf said in his smooth voice. His tone was disinterested, but diplomatically polite. not quite demanding, but not the friendliest either. "We are just passing through," Thorin growled, defensively, voice taut with rage. Legolas winced. If the Dwarf King had used a calmer, more respectful or diplomatic voice, Aglar would have let him go, or guided him through the forest. But the dwarf's voice had held nothing but scorn, stiffness, and loathing. In other words, he had just insulted and disrespected the elf. The Crown Prince's lip curled. It is impolite to pass through this realm without informing the Elven King, especially for royalty such as yourself. There was no mocking in Aglar's tone, only politeness, but his voice cracked like a whip. "You have your father's temper and icy wit," Legolas thought, half sadly, half in exasperation. "You can speak as sweetly as a bird sings, yet still carry insults in your tone. Why can't elves and dwarves get along for once?" It was obvious neither party liked or trusted the other, even with the elves wearing emotionless masks. Legolas could spot the open mistrust and anger on the dwarves' faces, the aloofness and fury in the postures of the elves only a little harder to spot. The ancient feud between elves and dwarves was not one the assassin understood. He knew people could hold grudges, but the ever-growing list of injustices between the two races was becoming ridiculous in his opinion. Had they never heard of the phrases, "let it go," or "the past is in the past"? Legolas briefly thought about leaping down and smacking both royals on the backs of their heads to try to knock some sense into them, before dismissing the idea and refocusing on the confrontation below. "You will come with us to meet the king," Aglar said. It was not a request. Thorin glanced at the pointy arrows aimed at his kin and nodded in angry consent. The elves relieved their prisoners of their weapons and marched them away, arrows pointing at the ground but still strung to their bows. Legolas moved to the tree above Bilbo, looking down at the hobbit and softly calling his name. Predictably, Bilbo jumped a foot in the air, letting loose a startled squeak. He looked up, terror fading, and smiled. "Esgol, you're here." The elf offered his hand, and the hobbit took it. Legolas pulled him easily up into the tree, setting him on a branch. Bilbo looked slightly nervous, but was not afraid like many hobbits would have been. He always liked to climb trees as a child, and his friendship with Esgol only made the habit more permanent. He was nowhere near as comfortable on a branch as the elf, but he was not afraid of heights or falling. Bilbo knew the assassin would catch him if he did. "How are you, Bilbo?" Legolas greeted the hobbit. "I'm all right," Bilbo replied. "I've had quite the adventure." "I can tell," the elf said, a little grave. "How is it that your group managed to not only run into a spider's nest, but also a patrol of warriors while fleeing said spiders?" Bilbo winced. "It's this forest. It's so heavy. Everything is dark and shadowed, and it seems like even the trees want to kill us," he shivered. "Some of them do," Legolas thought, but did not say. "I know. You should not have come here without a guide who knows these woods. Where is Gandalf?" "He's off doing something for the White Council," the hobbit said, sounding both worried and miffed. The assassin frowned. "He shouldn't have let you travel through here alone," he said adamantly, though we both know Thorin would not accept an elf as a guide. Bilbo sighed. "That is true." He looked in the direction that the elves and their dwarf captives had gone. "I need to rescue them." "It will not be easy," Legolas warned. "The elves of Mirkwood have become more vigilant as the shadow grows. Would you like my help?" Bilbo studied his friend for a moment, considering. He knew Esgol could get into Mordor and not be seen, which meant he definitely could sneak past a few elves. However, the hobbit had a new trick up his sleeve, or more specifically, in his pocket, that could get him into the palace easily enough on his own. There was no need to let Esgol know about his magic ring. No, Esgal, Bilbo said. I need to free them on my own. Legolas could see the hobbit's determination. He was still seen as useless by the dwarves sometimes, and needed to show he could assist them and was an asset to the group. They needed to see that Bilbo Baggins was not a fidgety, nervous hobbit who had no place on this mission. The dwarves had seen a bit of his bravery and valor when Bilbo faced down Azog to protect Thorin, but the feeling had faded slightly. Bilbo needed to do this himself. Very well, Legolas said. Good luck, Bilbo. With that, he vanished. Thorin Oakenshield stood stiff and proud before the Elvenking. The elf sat in his high-backed wooden throne, a crown of leaves and weaved wood upon his head. His posture showed dignity, power, and grace, and his face was an expressionless mask as he looked down at the dwarves. A few of the travelers, like Nori, shifted nervously under his sharp gaze, while others, Fili Kili included, stood with impassive, neutral expressions. Thorin was relieved his rambunctious nephews were keeping their silence. It would not bode well if one of the dwarves accidentally let slip details of their quest to reclaim Erebor. Bilbo was not among the group that had been captured, the Dwarf King noted. He was not sure whether he should be annoyed, hopeful, or irritated by the hobbit's absence. Where had he run off to this time? Could he help them escape? Probably not. While resourceful, Bilbo had no chance of sneaking past these wary elves. The Elven King spoke, voice musical and holding neither welcome nor condemnation. Thorin Oakenshield, what business do you have in Mirkwood? As I told your warrior, the Dwarf King said, nodding to the silver-haired elf that had apprehended his group, we are merely passing through. You head to the east, Thranduil stated. You seek to reclaim Erebor. A few of the dwarves behind Thorin shifted, betraying their unease and shock at the Elven King's knowing statement. The Dwarf King kept his silence, hiding his own feelings of bewilderment and anger behind a blank face. How had the elf known? How do you expect to reclaim your kingdom with 13 dwarves? Thranduil asked, cool disdain in his voice. Thorin bristled and glared at the elf. I would not have to reclaim it if you had assisted my people instead of standing by like a coward. The dwarf's eyes narrowed as he studied the golden-haired elf standing beside Thranduil. He looked remarkably like his king. Or were you too afraid of losing one of your precious sons to help us? Thorin did not notice the flash of grief that passed through the Elven King's blue eyes, or how the other elves in the room froze, faces tightening with pain. Thranduil's expression did not change, but his eyes burned like blue fire, all of his anger showing through his eyes. A few of Thorin's kin flinched and wilted under the fury in that gaze. Thranduil rose, and Thorin swore the pressure in the air changed, a feeling of weight and power settling over them. The Elven King spoke in a voice that was harsh and dark, and if his tone alone could kill, Thorin would be dead 10 times over. I was willing to let you continue with your suicidal quest, Oakenshield. He was not shouting, but a part of Thorin wished he were. The soft, seething tone in which he spoke sent shivers up the dwarf's spine, and he felt as if the Valor themselves were going to strike him down. But you have just insulted me in the worst way possible. Thranduil looked to the silver-haired warrior. Take them to the prison cells. The elves, faces colder than ice, did as their king commanded, escorting the dwarves down into the caverns that held their dungeons. They walked quickly, making the dwarves almost have to run, and did not look at them the entire way to the cells. Each cell was a 15 by 15-foot room made of stone with a metal barred door. There were 3 cots inside stacked along the walls, but that was it. Seeing as they were deep underground in the dungeons in the palace, there were no windows. The only light came from torches in the hall. All in all, the dwarves had seen better and worse prison cells. Thorin's only thought was that it was ironic that the elves would imprison people in stone and away from the sky they so loved. Do they keep their own kind imprisoned down here, or only outsiders, he wondered. The silver-haired elf stopped in front of the cells, opening 3 bar doors. He stepped back and glared at the dwarves. Get in. When the dwarves did not move, he laid a hand on his sword hilt. Now. Without protest, the dwarves quickly filed into the cells. The elf slammed the doors shut behind them, locking them before handing the keys to another elf. Before he could leave, Thorin spoke. So this is the hospitality of the elves, the Dwarf King said scathingly. They imprison travelers for calling their king a coward. The silver-haired elf's expression betrayed none of his feelings. If you had taken the time to learn the history of your neighbors, you would never have dared to speak of the king losing his sons. His youngest was killed by orcs. You hinted that he could do to lose a few more. Thorin's glare did not cease. So we are being imprisoned because an elf prince warrior died in battle, he said flatly and with a hint of contempt. Quick as a blink, the Dwarf King was off the ground, lifted by his shirt front. The elf was almost nose to nose with him, eyes alight with the same rage as the Elvenking. My brother was 5 years old when he was taken by orcs and tortured to death to spite my father, the prince spat. He was no warrior. He was a young child, an innocent, joyful elfling. Abruptly, the angry older brother dropped the stunned dwarf and turned away, speaking thickly. Guard them. He strode away, without looking back, posture stiff and strong. But Thorin had a feeling the prince was sobbing. Guilt and anger warred within the dwarf as he sat on the simple cot that served as a bed in the cell. His cellmates, Philly and Killy, looked at him with a mixture of horror and sadness. Uncle Thorin, Killy whispered. Is it true? Thorin closed his eyes, distantly remembering lessons in a stuffy little room filled with books. He recalled the smell of parchment, dust, and paper, and how his father solemnly told him a basic history of the elves of Mirkwood. He remembered one tale now, the story of the lost prince, the son of Thranduil that had been tortured and killed by orcs at the young age of 5. A part of Thorin's accusation had been true. Thranduil had been afraid to risk the lives of his sons. They must have been with the army that marched to Erebor after Thror slighted the elves. The realization that callousness may not have been the reason for Thranduil's unwillingness to help hit Thorin hard. If he had not let his anger and age-old prejudices take control of his words, he and his kin would be on their way to Erebor. Instead, they were in a cell after Thorin had practically told the Elvenking he did not care if the elf lost a few more sons. There was so much hatred and blame between elves and dwarves, and the Dwarf King suddenly found himself reeling from the intensity of it. Repetitive insults, mistrust, and hatred, passed down through the generations, kept the blood feud going. Dwarves and elves were both so stubborn, both so unwilling to reach out and ask for friendship with the other race. There was too much influence from the older members of both races for anything more than a stiff alliance to work. Thorin leaned back, staring at the rock ceiling, and feeling further from home than he ever had. Here he was, in an elven prison, trying to understand those who had captured him and his kin. He should be absolutely angry and indignant, claiming he and his kin were blameless, but he could not. After hearing the prince's words, and remembering lessons from so long ago, he just could not. After all, no matter what race you came from, the death of a child could not be scoffed at and scorned. and neither could the grief of a parent. Fighting spiders was both exhilarating and unnerving to Legolas. Unlike other animal servants of the shadow, spiders were both intelligent and beastly. Their intelligence proved to be their downfall, however, because intelligent creatures could recognize who and what they were fighting. He was Hashras, the Silent Slayer, and many spiders would meet their deaths by his hand this night. The spiders knew that, and were afraid. In the spider's nest, beneath the dark trees of Mirkwood, the assassin dodged a spray of sticky web and the gnashing pincers of one of the giant spiders, slashing sideways with his knives to cut one in half. The sharp blades cut through the tough spider's exoskeleton like a knife through hot butter. Legolas leapt upward, letting the spider charging at him go under him, landing on its back and jabbing downward. He rolled off the enemy, blades flicking up to plunge into the head of Shelob's kin. The assassin's eyes raked the mass of moving shadows, calm despite the number of spiders around him. If Legolas were alone, even he would not have dared to attack such a large colony of spiders. But he was not alone. The shadowed trees fought with him. The trees shook their limbs and stabbed at the spiders in and beneath their bows, letting out all of their anger at the giant arachnids. They fought even more savagely than the descendants of Shelob, literally ripping their enemies apart if they could. Their reason for fighting was simple. Spiders were the enemies of Dalas. No one would hurt their Dalas. Besides, the shadow trees were tired of having the sticky, uncomfortable webs wrap through them, making it hard for them to move their limbs. Knees bent, one leg out, Legolas twisted in a circle, knocking a spider's leg out from under it, and slicing off its head with his knives once it was down. He spun, arms straight, knives out, and slashed through the spiders that tried to surround him. Still turning, he twisted out of the way of a dropping spider, his blade stabbing into it as it hit the ground. He leapt, jumping from spider to spider as easily as he jumped through trees, blades hitting their target wherever he landed. The assassin's piercing violet eyes finally spotted what he had been searching for. A particularly large spider with green dots around her eyes and on her back was standing back from the battle, hissing and clicking loudly. That would be the queen, the leader of this colony. She was the one that kept the spiders united and prevented them from killing each other. Once she was dead, however, Legolas leapt backwards and up, landing in the tree above him. He stabbed the spider trying to sneak up behind him, letting its corpse fall to the ground. Then he drew his bow, fitting 2 arrows into the string. Sighting, he released. The arrows whipped through the air straight for the queen. She shrieked and dodged the first arrow and ran into the path of the second. The arrow plunged through one of her bulbous eyes straight into her brain. The queen collapsed, and the spiders froze, uncertain. Their leader was dead, and there were no more orders. They did not know what to do. The assassin bared his teeth in a smile. Now, my friends. The trees lashed out, swaying as they slashed, stabbed, and crushed the spiders beneath them. The spiders shrieked and tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go and not find angry, vengeful trees. The elf shot a few that were slipping between the trees' attack. A couple spiders escaped the massacre, but only a small part of the large colony. They would remain on their own or be killed by their kin. Spiders did not tolerate spiders from different colonies. That made the remainder of the colony a lot less dangerous than they had been. Legolas leapt down from his perch, wrinkling his nose in disgust as he surveyed the remains of his enemies. "Thank you," he told the trees. The trees were gleeful. "Nasty spiders are gone. They won't make icky stuck webs in our limbs any more." The elf nodded silently in response, deep in thought. He knew that the shadow trees could have evicted the spiders years ago, without his help. The only problem was, they did not acknowledge their need to until he brought it up. That was the way of the trees. They would wait patiently, not acting until asked. But once Delos did ask them for help, they would attack with all the loathing they felt towards the shadow, not truly knowing about their anger until then. This ignorance of their own feelings worried Legolas at times, and he knew the shadow was what was keeping the shadowed trees from attacking the servants of Sauron on their own. Legolas sensed the presence coming and smiled, turning to the left and waving cheerfully. Radagast! The brown wizard crept into the clearing, watching the now still trees with wary eyes. "Hello, Esgol. I see you've been busy today." He nudged a dead spider with his staff, scowling. "This colony kept taking elves and my animal friends. I'm glad you were able to take care of it." "It is much easier to kill spiders when angry trees are one's allies," the elf responded cheerfully. The trees rustled in response. Radagast had a feeling they were watching him. It felt like 1,000 eyes were boring into his back. He glanced around, grimacing at the dark, shadowy woods. His staff was gripped in both hands. The wizard tried to touch one of the trees, only to have it brandish its branches threateningly. He backed off, standing beside Legolas. "I'm glad you told the shadow trees not to attack me," the Astar said grimly, "although they do not seem to like me." "It didn't try to stab or cut you," the elf said seriously. "That means it is fine with your presence. If you don't antagonize them, the trees won't attack you." Radagast sighed. "If it weren't for you, I would not dare to come into this part of the forest. The elves can't even come close. You may have taught the trees restraint, but their hostility is enough to make the hardiest warrior flinch. How can you handle it so well?" The assassin shrugged. "I'm used to it. The darkness of the trees is nothing compared to the darkness where I grew up. It's helpful." He grinned, eyes glinting. "Enemies like the spiders never expect an elf to come over here." Radagast looked around at the carnage around him and glanced at his friend. "You scare me at times," he admitted. "Just a little." "Sorry," Legolas said. The wizard smiled easily. "It's perfectly all right. You're a wood elf. You're one of the wild ones." Legolas knew that was the truth. No matter what happened or what the shadow did, the elf would always be a free, wild spirit. Society would not bind him, and walls would never hold him. He was unique in ways only he could be, and in ways that had nothing to do with his eyes or suppressed glow. He did not have a set home, and traveled often. He preferred to stay outside and leap through trees instead of riding horses. He hunted to feed himself rather than go to shops. He spent hours looking at the stars, but was quick to switch his attention and hunt orcs or spiders. He attacked with the deadly grace of a predator, without mercy for his enemies. He could go from laughing to emotionless in a second, letting certain words wound him while completely ignoring others. He was not content in cities like the Noldor, or prone to sing like the Sylvan. He could not stay in one place for long, and loved the thought of new adventures tomorrow would bring. That was just how and who he was, and he had accepted that long ago. And so, in response to Radagast's words, the elf's lips twitched. "That I am," he agreed. "That I am."